Hey sightseers, Sightseeing Sally here. I'm with Marty and Mocha once again. And today we're checking out a National Historic Landmark here in Texas known as Fort Davis.
Yep.
Man, a few words. Now I get that some of you might find this a bit off topic given that we've been focusing mainly on small towns. However, I want you to consider that at one point this fort, being self-sustaining, was in and of itself a bit of a small town. Not to mention this is a really important historic site, being that it's on the National Register of Historic Places. So with that in mind, we're going to explore the fort. And this, by the way, happens to be all that's left of the hospital steward's quarters. If we look inside, we can see the remains of the old fireplace there yet, and a cutout here, which I can only assume is where the doorway was. If you're thinking that the fort was used for military purposes, you're kind of incorrect in thinking that. It was more or less here for helping those who were traveling the historic San Antonio-El Paso Road, at least originally. Named in honor of Jefferson Davis, Fort Davis was established in October of 1854 following the discovery of California gold. Its mission: to ensure the safety of those traveling along this southernmost route from dangers posed by the Apache, Comanche, and other warring tribes. Despite the futility of their efforts, up until the spring of 1861, Fort Davis served as a retreat for thousands of immigrants and other travelers, provided protection for mail carriers, and oversaw the establishment of stagecoach stations and military posts in the region. Later, when the Civil War broke out, the fort was abandoned by the federal government, and Confederate soldiers took it over. That is until the summer of 1862, when Union forces took possession of it. They quickly abandoned the post, and Fort Davis lay deserted for the next 5 years. Following the Civil War, travel along the San Antonio-El Paso Road continued, as did the attacks by the Comanches and Apaches. Thus, in June of 1867, the fort was reestablished and work commenced to rebuild, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Merritt and 4 companies of the 9th U.S. Cavalry that later became known as the Buffalo Soldiers. This is one of those places where I think if the National Park System hadn't taken it over, it likely would have fallen into ruin. And the officials here at the park have done a wonderful job at refurbishing a lot of the buildings. This here is the post's former hospital. Here you can see a recreation of what the ward would have looked like back in the day. There's even a fellow patient reading the newspaper. Now, it's my understanding from what I read on it is that most of the men that were here in the hospital were here not from injuries that they received from war, but rather injuries that they received while at the fort or illnesses. Not all patients who presented an illness spent time in the ward. Most were treated at the post dispensary and sent back to the barracks to recover. And according to this, those who were most likely to be admitted were those who suffered from things like smallpox, pleurisy, dysentery, along with like broken bones and sprains. And here we can see some of the men who died while serving at Fort Davis and their cause of death. Yikes! I guess being a soldier here at the fort didn't preclude you from dying by homicide or getting kicked in the abdomen by a horse. So not exactly like what Hollywood would want you to think. The soldiers at Fort Davis weren't the only ones to receive care at the hospital. people from all over the area came to be treated by the fort's medical staff. Check this out, they have their dispensary set up just like it would have been back in the day. This here is 2nd Lieutenant Robert Safford of Troop C, the 10th U.S. Cavalry. He became ill with dysentery, most likely from drinking contaminated water, and died while on a scouting mission. He was only 25. And interestingly enough, over here we can see that not all illnesses were treatable, and some of the reasons for getting a discharge included rheumatism, consumption, which was their word for tuberculosis, venereal disease, and debilitating injuries. And it sounds like to me the reason that they medically discharged so many soldiers was to keep the death rate low here at the fort. This here, by the way, is what the hospital looks like pre-restoration. You can see names and dates inscribed in the walls, and that's because, if I didn't mention this previously, the fort was abandoned prior to being taken over by the National Park System. One more thing I want to talk about here in the hospital before we move on to other things here at the fort, because there is really a whole lot of stuff to see here. And I know I might be boring some of you to death, it's just that I find the whole history on the hospital here to be fascinating. Anyways, the point that I wanted to make about this is that even though they talk about the best surgeons being here at the fort, in reality, surgery was rarely performed because of the slim chance of survival due to infection. And that is something I think in modern medicine we often take for granted, is that back then they wouldn't have survived many of the surgeries we perform today. And as a result, our overall life expectancy has increased dramatically since then. Take, for example, the disease of consumption, better known as tuberculosis or TB. Back then, it was one of the most common causes of death, both here at the fort and in the United States. And it was one of those things where either you got over it or you died. While the care here was considered exemplary for its place and time, it was nothing like what we've come to expect today with the advances in modern medicine. How'd you like to have to take diluted sulfuric acid for your symptoms? The one thing I do find kind of puzzling is that I'm wondering, where were the soldiers getting venereal disease? I mean, were there women stationed here with them? Kind of makes you wonder. Interestingly enough, venereal diseases were treated with chemicals such as mercury, sometimes in the form of blue mass pills, which when taken over time caused mercury poisoning. Anyways, moving along. During the second run post-Civil War, the troops at Fort Davis not only served as providing protection for travelers, they also built new roads, strung miles of telegraph wire, and surveyed land. Now here's something you don't see every day, an old covered wagon, and I think it's actually legit. It doesn't appear to be a replica, because you can see the wheels are made of wood and iron. Off in the distance you can see the ruins for the old bakery, the commissary and quartermaster storehouse. Over here we got the remains of a wood house, the hospital laundry, officers' quarters, and the remains of what was once the temporary hospital. There was even a blacksmith shop on site for a time. And in case you were wondering, here's the location of their old privy. Kinda ironic that it sits behind this huge boulder, don't you think? I wonder if that was intentional, you know, to give you a sense of privacy while you're doing your business. And I'm assuming the wood house is exactly what it sounds like, a house for storing wood, but I'm not really sure on that. So if you know, let me know if I'm right or wrong in the comment section below. This building here is what they call a magazine, which, if I'm not mistaken, is related to the storing of perhaps gunpowder or ammunition. But again, not certain on that, so if you know, leave it in the comment section. I know one thing, if Marty was still with me, he would know, he'd be able to tell us, but he wandered off because his attention span is about this big, plus the beagle was ready to, eat a grasshopper back there. Off in the distance, you can see the remains of something over there. Unfortunately, those aren't marked. I'm not really sure what they are. From here, they look like some sort of foundation for some sort of building. This here is where the commanding officers kept their horses in the stables. And then right over here is marked as the remains of an earth closet and another privy. Because with all the men that were stationed here, you just can't have too many privies. Especially if dysentery was a frequent flyer among the illnesses here. This is just an excellent site to come out and experience history. And if you stop and close your eyes for a sec, you can almost picture what it was like back in the day for the soldiers who were stationed here. Especially if you tune out the sound of the traffic in the distance. It's almost as if you were transported back to the 1800s. Just up ahead, you can see the back of what was known as Officers' Row, which is obviously where you would have stayed if you were a commanding officer. And we'll get up close to that here in a moment, but first I want to show you this. The remains of what was known as Sutler's Store. See what I mean about the fort being basically its own small town? They had basically everything they needed, their own medical services, stores, entertainment, well, maybe everything with the exception of female companionship. But then again, sounds like they didn't have too many problems in that department. Well, you know what I mean. In the beginning, accommodations, even for the officers, were nothing to write home about, in the words of Lieutenant Bliss.
Once in a snowstorm, snow blew under my bed, and it stayed there several days without melting.
It wasn't until the second run of the fort that many of the living quarters you see here were built. This particular home was once occupied by the Griersons or Griersons. Construction began in 1867 under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, who was the first to move in and call it home. Today, it's furnished to the time period when Colonel Benjamin H. Grierson and his family lived here. I really love how they restored and then furnished the officers' quarters such that you can get a feel for what it looked like back in the day. So often I read in the comments section of the Facebook groups I follow for abandoned lovers about how people wish these old historic homes and abandoned buildings would be restored to their original glory. Well, here at Fort Davis, this is a prime example of where they are working, our national park system that is working to restore these old buildings to their original glory. For example, this here is an old kitchen that was restored. You can see they've gone as far as even adding in herbs and other medicinal plants that they would have had in the garden back then. Something I just learned about the servants that served here at the fort is that usually it was difficult to keep women servants here. And the reason being, the single enlisted men viewed them as potential brides. But that still doesn't explain where they were meeting the women and getting the gift that keeps on giving. Maybe it was from going into town, which is just south of here. There is a town called Fort Davis. Just southwest of the Army post, at the crossroads of the Betterfield Overland Mail Route and the famous Chihuahua Trail,
A rough settlement started about the same time as the Army post. Originally called Chihuahua, by 1885 this small community on Olympia Creek had grown to 2,000 inhabitants. Never really a wild town, in its early days Fort Davis had 3 lawyers, 2 saloons, 2 churches, a milliner, cotton gins, grist mills, and a weekly newspaper called the Apache Rocket. Now the town, popular among those who enjoy Old West Texas, has a population of about 1,100.
Go figure. A town called Fort Davis?
Interestingly enough, as we explored the town of Fort Davis, we noticed a number of buildings that looked oddly familiar. And that's because some of the scenes from the movie Dancer, Texas Population 81 were filmed in Fort Davis. How's that for movie famous? As mentioned previously, some died during their time at the fort. Thus, to accommodate those who left this earthly life, there were several cemeteries on site.
This here is the last location that was used as a cemetery here at the fort. All in all, there were 6 cemeteries that were used during the time that the fort was active. Following the closure of Fort Davis, the remains of 91 enlisted men, 2 officers, and 7 civilians were disinterred and reburied in San Antonio.
Built on land the government did not own and 20 miles from the nearest railroad, Fort Davis eventually was seen as a drain on taxpayer money. With the fight against the Comanche and Apache over, the Army determined Fort Davis had outlived its usefulness and ordered it abandoned in June of 1891.
As I've been walking along, I've been thinking about it. Maybe some of the soldiers took up with some of the single women that were traveling by wagon train. If you know the answer, let me know in the comment section below.
Speaking of wagon trains, not everyone lured west by the promise of gold stayed there. Some found themselves so homesick they risked making that dangerous trip along the San Antonio-El Paso Road back east.
Which goes to show that just like in the imaginary tale of the Wizard of Oz, sometimes there's just no place like home. Until next time, this is Sightseeing Sally.